I wanted to ask you about your own experience of Rosh Hashanah. Do you relate to it? Does it work for you? Do you have a favorite moment or a favorite prayer that you can share with us?
Yeah, I relate to Rosh Hashanah itself as you're asking. I think for me, it's just the whole period of time. It's like getting ready for a marathon. You don't like all of a sudden just go and run the marathon. You get ready. So it works according to how much effort I put in. I think that I find one of the most meaningful sections of Rosh Hashanah, the preparation for Tkiyat Shofar. It's like everyone's settled down after the first part, and it's kind of an intensity. And there's a prayer that we say, Min HaMeitzar Karatiya, which is from the depths I cry out to you. And that's kind of calming us down just before we hear the Tkiyot, the blowing of the shofar, hoping that we'll somehow be oriented, listening enough so something can emerge and wake up. Besides that, there's a song in particular, Chamol Ma'asecha, which is just very close to my heart. So that's a very powerful kind of experience when everyone sings together.
How does the shofar work for you? Like, what do you get out of that? Do you have some sort of thing that you're concentrating on when they blow the shofar, something that you can share with us?
Well, I actually start blowing the shofar in my house. We're now in the third of Elul, the fourth of Elul, starting Rosh Chodesh Elul. After prayers, the morning prayers, we blow the shofar. So sometimes I don't go to synagogue, but I blow the shofar myself. So it's not just that I hear the shofar on Rosh Hashanah, but it's something that we begin to hear and we attune ourselves to, starting Elul until we arrive at Rosh Hashanah. So that's like a month. Maybe I didn't answer your question, but it's a process.
Well, what does the sound provoke in you? In other words, when you hear it, what does it make you think about? Or the reverse, is there something that you start to think about before it gets blown?
Yeah, I think of it as it's a much less cognitive type of experience. I think it's a very primal sound. It's a very powerful primal sound. The way it's described in the Mishnah Torah by the Rambam is Hitoru mishnatchem. It's a wake-up call to wake up out of a type of stupor, out of a sleepiness that we all into our regular routines. Not that routines are bad, they can be very positive, but there's always negative parts of our routine. So for me, the very primal sound is just jarring. It's jarring. It's much less. It's not an intellectual preparation. It's just a jarring. It hits you in your guts. That's the most honest and basic thing I can tell you about what that sound is.
So I think you're referring to a kind of existential motif of Rosh Hashanah, which is getting woken up. Getting woken up means that on some level we're asleep. So do you think that there's a situation where many human beings are asleep for much of their lives? What kind of sleep is that? In other words, what are we not awake to? And when you blow the shofar, what are you supposed to awaken to?
So those are all really important questions, Elliott. I think that we are asleep most of the time. I think habits, habitual behavior. I think in Hasidus, which is Hasidic teachings, very much rooted in the Talmudic tradition that I'm very connected to, speaks a lot about, I would say, two different modalities. There's ani, myself, and the ego, which is very much in conflict with God. If we want to hear, even if people don't believe in God, if you believe that there's an inner quiet, you could say your unconscious self or deeper parts of yourself, you can't, most often they're blocked out by your ego and by your ambition and by what you're doing. And you get driven and you're in habits and you get in certain modes. I think Rosh Hashanah is an amazing opportunity, if we take advantage of it, to, I would say, to make an effort to get back to something which is primal, is not intellectual, which is not about me, my desires, my interests, but something quieter and deeper. I would say something which is your more authentic self, which in religious language we understand as being connected to God.
So I think you're mentioning something here pretty crucial, which is that, especially in modernity, many people caught up in a kind of narcissistic self-involvement, and you're talking about a deeper self that can emerge at this time of year. But my question to you is whether the kinds of things that we look at, pray on Rosh Hashannah actually aid us in that. And I'll be more specific. When you look at a lot of the prayers, they say a lot of things about God as a king, God as judging us, and those are pretty abstract, remote, and somewhat fearful images. So what I'm asking you is, how do you reconcile that kind of language, which almost sounds like a demanding parent looking over your shoulder, with the kind of inner work that you think is the core of the holiday?
Okay, I can figure out how to start with that, Elliott. I actually am not afraid of judgment and of parental images. I think they're valuable and important. I think that sometimes authority, I'm not talking about authoritarianism, but authority, respect for contexts, or respect for holding oneself to a standard is important. The best way I can explain it to you is I think that every holiday has its own description of God, and God is infinite and filters into our world in different images. The image of a king and a melech is, I think that for me, in the context of Rosh Hashanah, I relate to melech and malchut. I would say much more from the context of going back to an ideal. Actually, in the Tefillah services, in the services, it actually says Hayom Harat Olam. This is the day that the world was conceived. It was a conception of a type of perfection which never came to be in the world. But to a certain extent, before we go busy forgiving ourselves, which happens later in Yom Kippur, we first have to figure out what is the standard that we need to hold ourselves to. And that's what I think a lot of those images come in to present. I'm not going to get into apologetics, but of course it's very important that our tradition is extremely layered. It isn't written for a modern person, but it is written, it's a collective conscious of the Jewish people that's been written. It's a layered, textured text. So there's a lot of different elements in it, and we need to feel the layers so we can appreciate what's going on in the Siddur. It's very hard for a person from the outside to come and read it. They'll feel very estranged from it. It's hard.
I just want to double back onto something you said, because I think it's very significant. You're actually rethinking the notion of authority. I posed the question, and you subtly corrected me and said, well, it's not an authoritarian notion, the idea of God as a king. It's there to remind people that there really should be a standard. And I think that's interesting in a day and age where much of the rhetoric that we have in contemporary culture is that everybody's okay, no matter what they do. And I think what you're saying is that on Rosh Hashanah, we set a standard. We say, it's not all okay, everything you do. And we're going to try and gently nudge you into reconsidering that maybe that wasn't a good idea, that thing you did. And we do have a higher standard. And that's not a bad thing or a punitive thing or a toxic thing. That's really important for people in terms of their growth. Would you say that's a fair statement?
I think you're being much gentler than I am. I want to put it this way. I think that a standard is crucial. I think people aren't happy if they don't have a standard. I don't think people really want to be forgiven so quickly. They want to know that they can achieve something. They want to know that they can expect something of themselves, and that in religious language that God expects something of you. If you look carefully also in the Rosh Hashannah service, a lot of it is also coupled with a description of Am Yisrael being holy and being special. And that is, I'm not going to get into the whole issue about, the Jews as opposed to non-Jews, because that's not its subject. But the reason why you're special or you're holy is because God has expectations of you. If you don't believe in God, you have expectations of yourself. And as I said, that every holiday emphasizes different aspects. So this holiday emphasizes the aspect of malchut, of a certain authority and of a certain standard. other holidays emphasize other aspects of God or the qualities.
You talked about forgiveness as not something that should come so easily, and here I actually concur with you. I think that forgiveness should be earned, and I think we all suspect the idea that just not apologizing and being forgiven anyway, that there's something off about that kind of forgiveness scene. I'm wondering if you think that there are situations in life, in your life, where something is not forgivable. Do you think that there are any lines that once crossed cannot be taken back?
We're now off of the Yom Kippur Rosh Hashannah topic per se.
We're flowing.
Do I think there are things that are not forgivable? In my own personal life, thank God, I don't think I've gone through anything so horrible that if a person, I think when people profoundly and deeply own up, your heart wants to forgive them.
What's your attitude to them
Again,
if they don't own up?
It's much harder. It's much, much harder. And I think I'm not sure I'm prepared to disclose. I didn't grow up in a simple, grew up in a very complicated environment. But at a certain point in my life, certain things that I think my parents did what they could do, it came to a certain point where I needed to really just forgive them for what it was that they were not capable of doing, so I could move on and have a healthy sense of myself, a healthy relationship with them, healthy relationship with my children, and move forward. So a lot of that really depends. Somebody, one of my students just disclosed to me something terrible that happened to her. I don't think in, pedophiles and things like that. I don't know if things like that are forgivable. We have such an individual on our block and they don't let him into the minyan. So I don't know what to say about that, Elliott.
I want to go back to something you said in relation to your parents, because I think it's really important. You're talking about the idea of forgiveness almost as a self-liberation, not tying it into whether they get it, what they've done to you, or they're sorry, or they apologize, but rather you're talking about the idea of a letting go. You understand that this person has done something to you, and you understand even more profoundly that they don't really understand what they did to you, and they never will. So what you're talking about is forgiving anyway. How do you think you in your life came to that point where you were able to do that?
I got older. I got older, and I wanted to be a more whole, happy human being. But I think it's more than that. I think, Elliott, what I think it comes down to really coming to recognize that we all have blind spots. And it's much easier for us to see somebody else's blind spot than it is to see our own blind spot. It's unbelievable how easy it is for us to see other people's blind spots and how much we really don't see our own. And I think as we get older and we realize that we really, I'm not a perfect parent. I remember I have 6 almost adult children, and I remember really I was a perfect parent before I had children. And I wanted, you wake up every day when you're a parent and you want to be a perfect parent. You want to be a good parent. And you make mistakes every day. So I think part of it is acknowledging and accepting your own limitations. And within that, when that happens, then you're able to begin to realize in a very, very deep inner place that other people have blind spots that they don't see. So I think at a certain point you realize you can spend the rest of your life being angry or being resentful, or somehow hacking away, hoping that somehow they're going to understand, or you can really just let it go. How do you let it go? Yeah, that's you make an internal shift with yourself, and it takes a certain amount of, I think, deep inner work, certain meditative practices to come to a deeper connection with yourself, with your own, I would say, shorish chaim, the root core of who you are, and you attach yourself to that place, and you know that everybody else has that place too. That's a lot for a couple of minutes, but
So
that's
I
part of
know
the
that you have
process.
your own meditative practice, and I want to circle back to that in just a minute. I'm really struck by what a lovely phrase you used there, which is that you were a perfect parent before you had children, right? And what that phrase suggests to me is the real difference between theory and reality, right? A lot of people have a lot of very strident ideas about things they've never experienced, but once they experience them, it's a whole different ballgame. And I think you're referring to the idea that part of the forgiveness process is giving up on some absolute 100% notion of getting justice. Like, I need things to happen in a certain way in my life, and if it doesn't happen that way, then I'm not happy. And you're talking about something that transcends that. You're talking about forgiveness as a process in which a person not only comes to terms with what the other person did to them, but actually comes to terms on a deeper level with life itself, that life doesn't work that way, that it's not perfect. And I think you're also suggesting that what forgiveness is really about is being human, recognizing the humanity in yourself and recognizing the humanity in other people. How does meditation help you in terms of two things? One, your own sense of self, and the other, whatever spiritual connections you might find. Perhaps you can describe for us a little bit the process that you do.
Okay. I want to be very straightforward and honest about this. I do not meditate, I pray.
Okay.
And I do, as of recently, certain, I would say, the deepest inner experiences that I've had over the past 30 years has been serious, profound, deep learning and teaching of Torah, and particularly of certain Polish Hasidic masters that I am particularly connected to. They describe their teachings are profoundly transformative, and they are both very intellectual, psychologically oriented, existential, and they're pointing towards a way to be. So after many, many years of studying and teaching and sharing these teachings with groups of extraordinary people, it's a privilege to teach wonderful people and continue to teach them, I realized that I study Hasidic texts. I would say I'm a Hasid of Hasidic texts, but I don't live in a Hasidic community. And we very much wanted to be more seeped in living in a more deep, authentic way, the internal teachings that these masters are pointing towards. In addition, I did over the past many, many years, I have also studied different Jewish texts, which have, again, it's not like the norm. People don't study them on a regular basis. And if you open up if you go to a regular traditional, what people tend to call an Orthodox synagogue, you're not going to go in there and find, oh, they're going to do Heat Bodhidut, which would be I suppose you would translate it as a type of meditative practice. You're not going to find that when you go into a synagogue. And that's something that we can discuss.
I just want to read it with you for one sec,
practices,
because of something you said before, which I find interesting. You said you don't meditate, you pray. By that, are you saying to me that prayer is different than meditation because prayer, you feel, is reciprocal? In other words, there's another entity there that's listening. We won't talk about whether that entity responds or not. Whereas meditate is more of a self-reflective process. Is that the difference that you're staking out there?
I would, at the end game, yes, that's true. Not that, again, I've done my share of reading John Kabat-Zinn and various other mindfulness practices, and but what I am interested in, and what the people learning with me are interested in, is yes, it looks very similar. Some of it is listening to your heartbeat, quieting your mind. It corresponds to nefesh, ruach, neshama. There are a certain specific practice that I began to develop based on certain teachings. But the idea is, even though I want to start from the ground up with your body, with yourself, feeling yourself and your body. But what you really want to do is you want to quiet yourself, because you want to feel that you are inhabited by your spiritual self, by your deeper self, and you want to touch that. And then your spiritual self and your deeper self is connected to a infinite source. And you want ultimately your meditative practice, if you want to call it that, or your prayer activity brings you to forges a connection between your inner self and you could say the larger self, the one self, God, and other human beings that you're interacting with.
So it's that
So
aspect
that would,
that
for
really
me,
is the difference, right? You're describing here the meditative practice almost as a prelude, getting your body quiet, getting your soul still. And then when that happens, that's the prelude to the reaching out part that you're describing. So to you, prayer is almost the thing that comes after you've gotten everything kind of quieted down inside. And then there's the reaching out part, which prayer represents. I understand that you indicated that you may not get that in an ordinary prayer service, but that would be the ideal. Is that so?
that quite frankly is what Jewish law indicates in the Shulchan Aruch by Yosef Cairo. He writes that people have to quiet their mind before they pray. There's plenty of regular classic standard sources that talk about that you can't pray until you can have kavanah, intention, which means you need to quiet your busy mind, which means if you're thinking about your lunch or your next business deal, then you can't pray. Um,
So, Batya,
so
from what you're
although
saying, it
people,
sounds like we should reorient prayer services, including Rosh Hashannah and Yom Kippur prayer services. It sounds like from what you're saying that there should be an almost structured time prior to prayer. I understand it would be nice if people did this on their own, but what happens if a community could do it as a practice, where everybody would come to synagogue and instead of just launching into prayer, your suggestion would be that there be a kind of communal quiet that gets facilitated. And once that happens, only then would we really be ready to pray.
so Elliott, I think our tradition is it's very multifaceted, and even what I'm describing is, let's say, what I'm describing is one mode, and Breslov does it in a different way. Um, I don't know if I would say now. I would like to say we should all now institutionalize coming in and sitting silently for 1 hour, like the Hasidim Harishonim, the first holy individuals, or that the Mishnah describes. I don't know. Certainly, there has to be more conscious effort in the prayer service itself. Um, you can say all kinds of things, that it's way too long and people couldn't possibly go through all of this with that much intention. So I'm actually much looser about it. I think that if a community, a lot of it also has to do with community. When a community is used to davening together, at a certain point they become like one body. They are used to certain songs. They very often they tune in with each other, and there's a certain intensity. Everyone's both kind of separate and together at the same time. So a lot of it also depends on community, on who is leading the prayer service. I'm not really sure that we can be so quick to say that we would make everything better if we now would institutionalize something else to start with. I mean, that being said, yes, I personally do a lot of my own work before I go to synagogue, and but I think also it waxes and wanes. We can't be in that level of intensity all the time. I do think we have to make an effort to quiet ourselves every day if you want that to be a part of your life. But it comes and goes. It comes and goes.
I think your
Meaning,
thoughts are unusual, and I imagine they come from an interesting background. I want you to fill us in a little bit on the Jewish life that you grew up with. Is your Judaism different than what you grew up with, and how and why?
how and why? Well, I grew up in as a child until I was in fourth grade. I guess until I was around 9 or 10 years old. I went to a conservative synagogue in Albany, New York, called Temple Israel. And then we moved. I became very active in a Reform synagogue, and I went to a Reform summer camp for many years, which was a very important part of my childhood. And in that environment, certainly youth group and summer camp, I was very involved with writing tefillot, creating tefillot, dancing tefillot, singing tefillot. It's a very important part of my life, of my summer camp life. What I found in the Reform community was summer camp was very intense. It had its very strong spiritual aspects to it, but it had no carryover. Like there was not really any carryover into the year. Most of the friends that I grew up with, who we were very intense partners in our spiritual activities as children, left the Jewish community altogether. Many people married out. So as a child, although I had never met a observant Jew, because observant Jews and non-observant Jews don't really have anything to do with each other. They're not in the same school. They don't travel in the same circles. That was the world that I knew. I grew up in an environment where being Jewish was very important. Having Jewish friends, going to a secular, regular public school, and going to Hebrew school. That was very important to my mother. And we didn't go to synagogue on a regular basis. Certainly not on Shabbat. We did not celebrate Shabbat. I did not grow up in a kosher home.
So your life is radically different than what you grew up with.
It is, but it was also a process, because as a child, I was very, very driven and very involved with Jewish leadership. From the time I can remember, I was involved with running things and Jewish things, and I was a musician, so I ran large musical events for the youth group. I was playing for hundreds of people on Shabbat, and leading services. So the truth is, it was on a certain continuum of being asking more questions, opening up Pandora's box, and getting more and more deeply involved in the Jewish world.
And that continuum has led us to where we are now, in the midst of a pandemic. And I wanted to conclude our conversation by asking you whether the present period of time, the coronavirus, has changed the way you think in any way about religion, about your life, about time passing. Is there anything different that you're going to be thinking about this particular Rosh Hashannah than previous ones, or not really?
The pandemic has not changed the way I think on a daily or regular basis. I mean, certainly I would say there's an intensification of feeling an interconnection with the world, and hoping and praying that the world as a whole will be more whole. I mean, I would say for me personally, what it has done is it's created much more of a feeling that the world is beginning to realize the things that I've been thinking about my whole life. So I feel like I have more people to talk to. In terms of tefillot, in terms of where we're headed, we certainly hope and pray that people will be healthy, that we will care more about each other, that the world become a more concerned and caring place to heal as many people as possible, so that people will not get sick and die from this terrible pandemic. But I would say on a daily basis, my life hasn't changed.
You have more people to talk to because people are more attuned to their fragility now and they're more willing to be real, or why do you have more people to talk to?
So I'd say in addition to the Torah classes that I teach, I started a Hidbodedut, which you might call the Jewish meditative practice, where we were meeting twice a week. At certain points during the pandemic, in the first few months, we met 3 times a week, sometimes 4 times a week. People needed a reason to get up first thing in the morning, to be together, to calm themselves down. Because people were kind of locked up at home and not going to work, they were more available, and people felt a need. I actually thought it would be very weird to do a type of breathing exercise and meditative practice online. But the truth is that it worked, and it was wonderful, and it was very special. So that was just a very small, tiny litmus test example of people coming together and feeling like the pandemic had caused for people a lot of anxiety, and they felt they needed to calm down and quiet in their inner selves by themselves with some guidance and with other people.